Modern engines rely on 70 to 100 sensors to survive, yet sensor faults cause nearly 40% of all check engine lights. When just one sensor gets dirty, fuel economy can drop 10 to 20%, while hidden engine damage quietly piles up. Most drivers replace expensive parts and never fix the real problem because almost no one cleans the sensor that fails most often. If you care about reaching 200,000 miles, keep watching. Number 5 is the sensor mechanics rarely mention, and it is costing drivers thousands. Sensor 1. The engine bodyguard you never think about. This tiny microphone bolted into your engine block is the only thing standing between smooth combustion and silent internal destruction. The knock sensor listens for detonation, an uncontrolled explosion that sounds like metallic pinging and sends shockwaves through pistons and bearings. Inside the sensor is a piezoelectric crystal that converts vibration into an electrical signal. The moment knock is detected, the ECU pulls ignition timing to protect the engine. But here is the problem. Oil seepage, corrosion, or baked-on grime between the sensor and the engine block interferes with that signal. When that happens, the sensor either misses real knock or reports knock that is not there. Missed knock leads to piston and bearing damage you will not hear until it is too late. False knock causes the ECU to permanently pull timing, making the engine feel weak, sluggish, and unresponsive. I once cleaned and properly torqued a filthy knock sensor on a Subaru, and the engine immediately felt sharper, smoother, and stronger. Detonation can raise cylinder pressure by 20 to 30%. Sustained knock can destroy an engine in as little as 10,000 miles. The sensor costs a few $100s. An engine rebuild costs thousands. Sensor 2, the lying lifeline. That red oil can on your dashboard only tells the truth if the oil pressure sensor is not clogged with sludge. When it is, it can lie while your engine is dying. The oil pressure sensor threads into an oil gallery and uses a diaphragm to convert pressure into a signal for the dash and the ECU. But sludge, varnish, and metallic debris can block the sensor's port completely. When that happens, the sensor may report perfect oil pressure even as the crankshaft and bearings are starving. I once diagnosed a Chevy that showed healthy oil pressure on the dash, but a manual gauge revealed dangerously low pressure. The sensor port was packed solid with sludge. A dirty sensor can also trigger false warnings, sending drivers chasing problems that do not exist. Bearings can be damaged in minutes without oil pressure. Once that happens, the engine's life expectancy collapses fast. Replacing an engine can cost anywhere from $4,000 to $12,000. Meanwhile, the sensor itself is usually a few $100s, and in some cases, careful cleaning restores accurate readings. The real danger is not the sensor failing. It is the sensor lying and silencing the only warning your engine has. Sensor 3. The brain's thermometer. When the engine computer doesn't know the real temperature, every decision it makes gets more expensive. The engine coolant temperature sensor threads into a coolant passage and changes resistance as temperature rises. That single signal controls fueling, ignition timing, idle speed, cooling fan operation, and even transmission behavior. But rust, scale, and sludge from neglected coolant coat the sensor tip and distort its reading. The ECU now believes the engine is cold when it's actually fully warmed up. As a result, it runs rich all day. That excess fuel washes oil off the cylinder walls, accelerates piston ring wear, contaminates engine oil, and overheats the catalytic converter. Fuel economy can drop 10 to 25% without triggering an immediate warning light. I've seen engines idle rich for hours because the sensor insisted they were still warming up. The sensor costs a couple $100s. A catalytic converter can cost several thousand. When the brain's thermometer lies, the damage doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly, quietly, and expensively. Sensor 4. The mixture referee. This sensor fine-tunes every drop of fuel your engine burns, and when it gets contaminated, your engine starts wasting money instead of gasoline. Mounted in the exhaust stream, the oxygen sensor measures how much oxygen remains after combustion. It sends a tiny voltage signal, constantly switching, to tell the engine control unit whether the mixture is rich or lean. The computer then adjusts fueling thousands of times per minute to stay near the ideal ratio. But oil consumption, coolant leaks, silicone vapors, and cheap fuel coat the sensing element. When that happens, the sensor still works, just slower. That delay is enough to throw off fuel trims. The engine control unit reacts too late, drivability suffers, emissions rise, and the catalytic converter begins to overheat or to become fuel-soaked. I once had a vehicle fail emissions twice with no trouble codes. The upstream oxygen sensor was not dead, it was just lazy. Replacing it fixed the issue instantly. Oxygen sensors are among the most common causes of emissions failure. A new sensor costs a few $100s. A damaged catalytic converter can cost several thousand. When this sensor lies, fuel turns into heat, and heat turns into expensive repairs. Sensor 5. The delicate one nobody cleans. This is the most neglected sensor in the engine bay, and it is responsible for a huge percentage of mysterious drivability problems. The mass airflow sensor sits in the intake and uses a heated wire or film to measure incoming air. The engine control unit calculates fuel delivery directly from that signal, so accuracy is critical. Dust, oil mist, pollution, and residue from oiled air filters coat the sensing element and insulate it. That tiny layer is enough to skew the reading. The engine control unit now delivers the wrong amount of fuel. Idle becomes rough, throttle response suffers, fuel economy drops, and lean or rich codes appear. I have seen countless drivers replace coils, injectors, and fuel pumps when the real fix took 10 minutes with the correct MAF cleaner. Around 40% of fuel trim faults trace back to dirty MAF sensors, not failed ones. Replacement costs can reach $700. Cleaning costs almost nothing, but touching the wire ruins it. Left dirty, the engine control unit keeps correcting bad data and eventually overheats the catalytic converter. This is the sensor mechanics almost never mention, and the one that quietly costs drivers the most. Sensor 6. The load calculator. When this sensor gets bad data, the engine control unit thinks you are flooring the throttle even when you are not. The MAP sensor measures intake pressure so the computer can calculate engine load. On many engines, it replaces the mass airflow sensor. That single reading determines fuel delivery, ignition timing, and transmission behavior. The problem is the vacuum passage feeding the sensor. Oil vapor, carbon buildup, cracked hoses, or loose fittings can restrict or contaminate it. When that happens, the pressure reading goes wild. The engine control unit believes the engine is under heavy load and starts dumping fuel. Idle becomes unstable, black smoke appears, fuel economy collapses, and the exhaust reeks of raw gasoline. I once had an SUV roll in running so rich it looked like a diesel. The MAP port was completely plugged. Cleaning it fixed the problem instantly. Nearly 80% of MAP-related issues trace back to dirty ports or hoses, not failed sensors. Ignore it long enough and fuel-soaked catalytic converters follow, along with a massive repair bill. Sensor 7, the engine's eyes. When this sensor cannot see clearly, the engine does not limp. It panics. The crankshaft position sensor tells the engine control unit, ECU, exactly where the crankshaft is and how fast it is spinning. That information is critical. Without it, the engine control unit does not know when to fire the spark plugs or to inject fuel. The sensor reads a toothed trigger wheel on the crank pulley or the flywheel, generating a precise signal the engine control unit depends on every second the engine is running. Oil leaks, metal shavings, and road grime can coat the sensor and weaken that signal. When that happens, you will see long cranking, random misfires, hot stalling, or sudden engine shutdown, sometimes at highway speed. I have had multiple vehicles towed in for bad fuel pumps that were fixed by wiping metal fuzz off the crank sensor. This is one of the most common causes of sudden shutdowns. A replacement usually costs a few $100s, but driving with misfires allows raw fuel into the exhaust, overheating the catalytic converter and turning a small problem into a multi-thousand-dollar repair. When the engine loses its eyes, it does not warn you. It just shuts off. Sensor 8. The timing maestro. This sensor keeps the entire engine in rhythm. The camshaft position sensor tells the ECU which stroke each cylinder is on, so it can time fuel injection and control variable valve timing accurately. Without it, the engine loses precision and falls back into a crude backup strategy. Oil sludge, leaking seals, and dirty timing components contaminate the sensor pickup and weaken its signal. When that happens, the ECU loses track of valve timing. Idle becomes rough, throttle response suffers, fuel economy drops, and cold starts become difficult. Many drivers feel hesitation between 2,000 and 3,000 RPM and assume the engine is worn out. I once watched a driver replace ignition coils, plugs, and even a throttle body while chasing misfires. The real problem was sludge blocking the cam sensor signal. Cleaning restored normal operation instantly. A replacement sensor typically costs a few $100s. Damage to the variable valve timing system can run into the thousands. When the conductor loses the rhythm, the entire engine orchestra stumbles. Sensor 9. The pedal translator. This sensor is the only reason your engine understands what your right foot wants. The throttle position sensor mounts to the throttle body shaft and works like a precision volume knob. As you press the pedal, it sends a smooth voltage sweep to the engine control unit, telling it exactly how much throttle you are commanding. Over time, heat, moisture, and carbon dust wear the internal resistive track. That creates dead spots and noisy signals. The engine control unit now receives conflicting information. The result is jerking at steady speeds, hesitation on acceleration, flat throttle response, and occasional stalling. I once graphed a throttle position sensor signal that looked like a heart monitor. Every dropout matched the driver's complaint perfectly. Replacement costs are relatively modest, but throttle body contamination often makes the symptoms worse. Ignoring throttle position sensor faults also confuses the transmission, since throttle data controls shift timing. When the translator glitches, the conversation between you and the engine breaks down, and the vehicle stops responding when you need it most. Sensor 10. The silent trimmer. Most drivers do not even know this sensor exists, yet it quietly affects power and fuel economy every time you drive. The intake air temperature sensor measures how hot or cold the incoming air is, so the engine control unit can calculate air density and adjust fueling. Hot air is thinner. Cold air is denser. The fuel mixture depends on getting that number right. The sensor sits in the intake duct or manifold, and over time it gets coated with oil mist, dust, and residue, especially from oiled air filters. That contamination skews the reading. The engine control unit now trims fuel incorrectly, often by just a few % at a time. That is not enough to trigger a warning light, but it is enough to make the engine feel dull, unresponsive, and thirsty. Fuel economy can drop quietly without any obvious symptom. In hot climates, I have cleaned intake air temperature sensors, and drivers swear the engine instantly feels lighter. These sensors are inexpensive, but they are rarely inspected. When this sensor lies, it does not cause dramatic failures. It slowly drains efficiency every single day, and most drivers never realize why. Sensor 11. The shifting whisperer. This sensor tells the car how fast it is actually moving, and when it gets dirty, the transmission starts guessing. The vehicle's speed sensor reads output shaft speed and sends a pulse signal to the engine control unit. That data controls shift timing, torque converter lockup, cruise control, the anti-lock braking system, stability systems, and even the speedometer. Because it is magnetic, the sensor attracts metal dust from normal transmission wear. Add road grime and sludge, and the signal becomes distorted. Shifts turn harsh or delayed. Cruise control drops out. The speedometer jumps. I once fixed a violently shifting minivan by simply cleaning metal fuzz off the vehicle's speed sensor tip. The transmission was not failing, it was confused. Replacement costs are modest compared to transmission repairs. Yet this sensor is often overlooked, and transmissions get misdiagnosed as worn out. Bad data leads to bad decisions, and when the computer cannot trust vehicle speed, it guesses. Guessing is how small issues turn into major drivetrain repairs. Sensor 12. The liar in the tank. If your car stalls with a quarter tank showing, this is usually why. The fuel level sensor lives inside the tank and uses a float that sweeps across a resistive strip to report fuel level. Over time, varnish, oxidation, and sediment coat the contacts and track. The readings become erratic, inaccurate, or flat-out wrong. I've opened fuel pump modules where the strip was polished smooth from years of movement. Sometimes careful cleaning restores accuracy. Other times the entire module must be replaced. A bad fuel level sensor won't damage the engine directly, but it will strand you. Worse, it can cause drivers to run the tank too low, overheating the fuel pump and shortening its life. When this sensor lies, drivers lose trust in the vehicle. And once trust is gone, every noise and hesitation feels like a bigger problem than it really is. Sensor 13, the hidden villain behind ghost faults. Sometimes the sensor is not bad. The engine is not bad. The wiring is. Connectors, grounds, and harnesses live in a brutal environment of heat, vibration, moisture, and chemicals. Corrosion, loose grounds, and worn terminals can create intermittent signals that mimic sensor failure perfectly. I have fixed more bad sensors by cleaning grounds than by replacing parts. Cleaning can recover circuits and stop false faults. A dirty ground can cause voltage drops that confuse the ECU, trigger false codes, and send technicians chasing ghosts. Cleaning usually costs nothing. Guessing costs hundreds. Dirty does not always mean broken. Replacing parts without diagnosis is expensive gambling. Clean first, test second, replace last. That approach saves engines, saves money, and prevents perfectly good parts from ending up in the trash. If this saved you money, subscribe. Share it with someone who works on their own car, and comment which sensor surprised you most. Don't miss our next video on hidden problems that quietly destroy fuel economy.